Look, I've talked about Bayonetta a lot, and she's probably going to feature in the Heroine series at some point, so I think it's worth asking the question. Is Bayonetta worth playing in 2024? Because, you know, you often hear people bring up Bayonetta when trying to make a political point about sexualization, and for good reason, but if you actually like video games, is it worth the time? For those that don't know, Bayonetta is an action game created by Platinum Studios that hit the West in 2010. Now, the real ones know between 2010 and 2017, Platinum sat among the cream of the crop for their action games, and this is in large part thanks to games like Bayonetta, Metal Gear Rising, and Nier Automata. Of course, all good things come to an end. The industry steered course away from the spectacle and excess that characterizes gaming of the 2010s, and so we tend to see less of that kind of thing. That said, Bayonetta is 3 games deep, so there's got to be something to it, right? So where to begin? Well, at the most fundamental level, you can describe Bayonetta as gun-fu dommy-mommy babe simulator with wicked combos served directly from hell with sass. And I think that might be underselling how much style the game has as an action hack and slash, but surprisingly there is a plot to it, so let's have a look. The prologue explains that there were 2 ancient clans in Europe that guided mankind's history in an amicable fashion. One was aligned with heaven and the sun, the other was aligned with the moon and inferno. The objective was balance. So anyways, it's implied that a sun guy and a moon girl decided to knock boots, and they had a child together, causing a pretty big rift that then resulted in a war which would bring an end to both clans. It is implied that Bayonetta is the child of that cursed union, and she was set to slumber and buried in a coffin beneath a lake. An unknown voice calls Bayonetta to rise, unleash her power, and awaken the eyes of the world. Bayonetta wakes up in our present day, and this is where our story begins. The game kicks off in a cemetery where Bayonetta is praying over a casket dressed as a nun. Angels fly down on rays from heaven to attack Bayonetta, which then results in her nun outfit being conveniently torn up to the sounds of, let's say, pleasure. So yeah, look, this isn't a game for kids, and if you cannot stomach the sexual teases and innuendo in the opening scene, you probably don't have the guts for what's to come. If this bothers you, I invite you to use the handy dandy pause button and click somewhere else. You have been warned. So anyways, Bayonetta kicks their asses and heads back to the city with the help of Enzo and Rodan. Bayonetta has struck a deal with Enzo to trade for information that will help her uncover her past, and Rodan is a demon who takes delight in creating weapons and acts as a barkeeper and a gunsmith for Bayonetta. Enzo also owes Rodan money, so Rodan likes to keep him close. On the way back to the city, there is a plane crash, and Bayonetta is confronted by someone using the same powers as hers. The two exchange a few words, kill a few angels, and then the stranger runs away, leaving Bayonetta with more questions. This encounter, along with the information provided by Enzo, sets Bayonetta on an adventure to Europe where she seeks for the secret of her past. We'll come back to the story, but first I want to talk about how this game looks. I first played Bayonetta on PlayStation 3, which was the worst possible port. I'm currently playing it on PC, and it's a lot better in terms of frame rate and stability. That said, make sure you run the application as an administrator, as you may come across crashes. Anyways, I'm of 2 minds about Bayonetta's graphics. On one hand, a lot of the enemy actions apply a blur effect that detracts from the graphical clarity, and it feels like there's this white filter that just sits over the top of the entire game, desaturating the image and destroying the contrast. In addition to this desaturation, it is also true that all the surroundings are generally muted and color filtered. This is likely an intentional action, since it brings a lot of focus to Bayonetta's reds, purples, and blues when she fights, which is fitting since she's the kind of character that demands attention. Nonetheless, you get the feeling that a lot of the scenery and objects are a that'll do pig situation. They're not bad, but the contrast to the detail in the character shows. On the other hand, the art style is awesome. Bayonetta looks badass. It's a really nice touch that Bayonetta's shadow shows the demon that she has formed a pact with. The angels you have to send to hell strike this interesting balance of looking both deific and horrifying at the same time. And the spectacle on offer is jaw-dropping. The demons that you summon wrapped in hair also contrast really nicely with the angels to treat the player with some satisfying kaiju action. Ultimately, I think the graphics are still fine in 2024. You'll see the desaturated browns and the scenery and instantly think, yep, 360 era. You'll have to make your own judgment call on whether that is good enough for you, but Bayonetta for me passes the bar of looking good enough to sell the crazy sexy action spectacle on display. Also, Bayonetta herself is the most detailed thing, and you're going to be looking at her most of the time. trust me. So it's fine. Usually as a game series goes on, the graphics improve, but Bayonetta is the only game in the series that is not locked to Nintendo consoles, so it uniquely benefits from hardware improvements, and as a result, even though the color contrast and visual effects improve as the series goes, Bayonetta is far cleaner and readable in its details. Let's talk Bayonetta herself. Why is she so powerful? Well, she's an Umbra Witch, which means she made a pact with a demon so she can see and interact with heavenly and hellish beings, but on top of all of this, all of her magic ability that allows her to control demons, summon giant torture devices, slow down time, and portal a demon fist or heel into someone or something's face acts through her hair. This includes Bayonetta's clothes. What does this mean? Well, more magic, more hair, and if the hair is being used for magic, it can't be used to make clothes, and therefore Bayonetta is mostly naked whenever she summons the larger kaiju demons. For weapons, Bayonetta starts with 4 handguns, 2 of which clip into her boots, but she soon swaps to special demon-made handguns named Scarborough Fair. Of course, as the game continues, you get access to other weapons, but these are the iconic ones that you see on the box and what Bayonetta is known for. So yeah, Bayonetta is a gun-fu wet dream with witches. But if Hack and Slash and John Wick has taught me anything, it's the plot, graphics, and main protagonist are ultimately secondary to the gameplay and action. And obviously the most frustrating thing in any game is when you are shown this badass character doing badass things, but then you are handed the controls and your character is moving around like a goose and you can't do any of the cool stuff. I'm happy to report that Bayonetta nails it. The controls are responsive, movement is fluid, the combat system is simple enough to get in 5 minutes and deep enough that you can mess around with it for hours. You all know how this works. You have a punch and a kick button. Different combinations of punches and kicks with or without the addition of pauses will give you different combos. Since Bayonetta has a gun attached to each limb, holding down a punch or kick will fire the weapon for the duration you hold down the button, which is a nice way to add some extra damage mid-combo. When an enemy is about to hit you, hit the dodge button. If you get the timing right, you slow down time. This is called witch time in the game, where you can just wail on your enemies while they are stuck in place for a while. In addition, you can lock onto a target and shoot your pistols while strutting around like you're on a catwalk. Quickly rotating the left analog stick and pressing punch or kick will lock you into place and put you into an over-the-shoulder view so you can have a gun-fu moment where you shoot everyone around you. Also, almost forgot that fighting, dodging, and taunting fills a mana bar which can be spent on certain magical abilities, but the most important one is torture attacks. We'll talk about these more later, but it's things like summoning an Iron Maiden or a guillotine to, well, torture angels. It's quite satisfying. So yeah, that's the basics. Later in the game, you can turn into a panther and a raven, and there are additional techniques that you can buy along the way to add to Bayonetta's repertoire. Bayonetta also allows you to take advantage of your environment. For example, you can lift up and throw most cars you can see, and angels will sometimes drop their weapons, which you can then pick up and use against them. Like with anything, variety is the spice of life, and your in-game scores are dependent on combo variety, time, and damage taken. At least those are the most important factors. Using continues and items also takes away from your score. Bayonetta's basic game loop is simple but very compelling. In any given scenario, it's going to be something like this. Opening badass entrance scene, run down hallway, fight. Badass cinematic, light puzzle, fight. Bridge with light platforming, fight with new enemy type. Badass cinematic to end level. So look, most of the game is fighting in arenas and cutscenes, so if you aren't a fan of those two things, then Bayonetta is a wash for you. Now that is the standard affair, but Bayonetta is so wild that whenever the plot demands it, the game just introduces a new mode of gameplay. For example, there's a motorbike chase level, there's a bullet hell while riding a rocket, there's an ocean level where you're surfing a steel plate from a crashed plane, and of course a turret segment because 2010. You know what else is so 2010? Quick time events and arthritis-inducing button spamming to power up your big attacks. Both of these things are in Bayonetta for better or worse, but we'll talk about that soon because we haven't talked about the boss fights yet. So boss fights usually fall under one of two categories. It will either be some massive angel, and then others are deals with characters similar to Bayonetta herself. So for example, Temperantia takes up the entire screen, and you really need to dodge his attacks until there's an opening to put together some damaging combos. In Temperantia's case, destroying the tentacles does damage, which will then lead to opportunities to run up his arm, complete a gauntlet, and attack the shoulder, leading to a demon summon that will rip off the arm. Repeat this again to the other arm, and then you fight the face directly to win the fight. All the while, you have to jump from platform to platform as Temperantia destroys them. There's often multiple stages where the mode of gameplay changes, and usually the size of the enemy and how they behave alters how you engage with the environment. The other kind of boss fight is more like a duel. For example, the strange lady that uses Umbran magic at the beginning of the game will attack you at several points through the story, and this is more like playing a mirror of yourself. Each time, of course, a new element is added and the complexity increases. The lady's name is Jeanne, and she's pretty important to the plot, but the last 2 times you fight Jeanne are my favorite boss moments in the game. There's just this moment where you're frantically dodging and weaving in combos back and forth with her, and you just realize, damn, I'm actually doing it.
I know Kung Fu.
Jeanne is actually a pretty good measurement of the approach to difficulty scaling in Bayonetta as well. As each encounter scales in complexity with Jeanne, so too do the normal encounters. At first, it's just a few normal angels with 1 or 2 attacks. In the next encounter, you might fight a mixture of melee angels and ranged angels. Then you might fight one big angel by itself, and finally the game will put them all together, so there's a gradual incline in complexity. You'll also see some bosses return. For example, you will fight a Temperanta later in the game, but this is a turret section, so all repeat bosses are usually shorter fights and approached in a different manner, giving you this feeling of becoming more powerful as you go. So to say that I like the gameplay in Bayonetta is an understatement. The combos are fun, the immersion in the power fantasy is thick while maintaining a sense of challenge. Bosses and enemies are interesting. Honestly, every time I saw a new type of angel, I was thinking, I wonder what contraption I'll summon to torture them. The game throws these curveball levels out of left field that keep things fresh, and the pacing is linear and direct, but also not rushed. As I mentioned, there are some puzzle moments that break up the pacing a bit. There are also collectibles, portals to the bar that Rodin runs, and challenge arenas peppered throughout. So it's not all combat, but I'd say these elements are definitely a secondary affair, and Bayonetta does a good job of giving a little variety and space, but it still remembers what it is. Remember that I say this, by the way, because it's going to come back to bite the series later, but I digress. In this case, the linearity of Bayonetta keeps things moving and doing what Bayonetta does best, creating cinematic action moments and challenging action combat that indulges in its own excess. Bayonetta, the character, and the game are confident in what they are, and that deserves respect in 2024. I think a lot of newer games suffer from a level of clutter that comes from trying to be too many things to too many different people. Now, I've said a lot of good things about Bayonetta, but there are times I wanted to bite my controller in half. Out of all the Bayonetta games, this one is the hardest. Basic enemies take more of your health bar. There are more insta-kill moments, and some enemies simply have no chill. In some ways, it's very fulfilling, but what is not fulfilling is the difficulty introduced through annoying mechanics and gotcha moments. So let's start with the most basic and annoying aspect, and that is save points. Sometimes they are reasonable, and sometimes they are not. For example, one boss fight I kept failing would take you back so far that you had to run down a hallway, complete a fight, and then go through or skip a fairly lengthy cutscene. It's just annoying to have to play those meaningless segments over and over when you're struggling on a boss and you want to get back to the fight. Another annoying aspect was how fast you had to spam buttons to power up attacks. Hear me out on this one because there's a bit of nuance. It's fine to have button mashing segments. Most of them really just power up the score you will get from the attack. My issue is first how fast you have to mash the button, and secondly, sometimes if you didn't do it fast enough, it resets your progress and you have to do it again until you get it. Some of these were also 2 gauges long. These 2 aspects together just made me feel bad for my poor controller. And obviously the devs agree with me, the series would become a lot more lenient with these in future games. So I think I'm right about it being a bit too much. Oh, also, this shows up in the Temperanta fight as well. Sometimes you'll be standing on a platform and the game wants you to press a button to activate a QuickTime event to jump to another platform, but the prompt only appears if you're standing on a certain area in the platform and there are no indicators. It's a minor gripe, but it can feel really bad to fail simply because you didn't know where the imaginary circle was that the game wanted you to stand in. Aside from these gripes, I'll also mention that Bayonetta suffers a little from the same curse all action hack and slash games suffer from, and that is is that the camera tries to get everything in frame, but it's not always possible to see everything, and sometimes you just can't see what all the enemies are doing. It's really the same in all games of this type, and the sound design does a lot to alleviate it with appropriate sound cues, but it is just inevitable that at some point you're going to die, and it's because the camera decided to pan at an awkward moment, or you just can't see the attack coming. Last but not least, Bayonetta has a habit of ending its cinematics with an opponent attacking you. The camera cuts from the cinematic directly into gameplay with the opponent in mid-attack. After a while, you just get into the habit of pressing the dodge button anytime a villain makes a sudden movement because you don't know when the game is going to throw you back into the thick of things. There are also a couple of things that are sort of take it or leave it. For example, after each chapter, there is an arcade shooting game called Angel Attack that lets you accrue a few extra credits. While more is more, I also just felt like this was just a roadblock to the real game. There's also some light crafting in the menus if you want to indulge in it, but honestly, I don't think I would have missed it if it wasn't there. It's just not all that compelling, and again, it takes you away from what Bayonetta does best. Now, what Bayonetta is not best at is storytelling. Don't get me wrong, the premise and the surrounding lore of the world of Bayonetta is cool. I mean, you have heaven, hell, and earth in different dimensions existing on top of each other and linked through purgatory, and then you have these moon and sun cults that were entrusted with the left and right eye of the world so they could govern humanity, but it all falls apart because of Bayonetta's birth. So yeah, there's a good base to work with here. Without spoiling too much, aside from Enzo and Rodan, you're going to come across a journalist named Luca that witnessed Bayonetta's rebirth in present time. Unfortunately, Luca's father died the moment he came into contact with Bayonetta when he was a child, so Luca seeks to expose Bayonetta's existence to the world and bring her to justice. Luca's mostly comic relief. He's clearly depicted as handsome and a bit of a ladies' man, but aside from the knowledge he dug up over the years and a grappling hook, Luca is severely unprepared and underskilled in taking on anything within the world of Bayonetta, and as such, Bayonetta often enjoys teasing him. Of course, Bayonetta has her reasons, but she does not feel responsible for the death of Luca's father. Bayonetta will also run into a little girl called Cereza that thinks Bayonetta is her mother. Cereza is special in that she can see angels and demons. Bayonetta is not heartless. She doesn't wish to harm humans unless she has to. However, look at her. Does Bayonetta look like the nurturing type? So Bayonetta does try to reluctantly guide Cereza home, however angels have other plans and Bayonetta ends up saddling Luca with babysitting duties while Bayonetta goes to kick ass. One thing that Bayonetta's story handles fairly well is character development. While Bayonetta is not a nurturing person by nature, you can see her open up in the presence of Cereza over time. While Luca is a handsome fool that Bayonetta loves to tease, he does prove himself to be both resilient and reliable. You can see Bayonetta move from curious teasing to genuine interest over the course of the story. Jeanne, on the other hand, is a great character and important to the story, but so poorly explained and rushed. While I think she's my favorite antagonist in the game to fight against, when her motives and reasons are revealed, it's just a case of whiplash that if you aren't paying careful attention, you would assume she's bipolar. The main villain in the game is so inexplicably evil that it doesn't make sense. In fact, it makes so little sense that they had to explain it in Bayonetta 2, but that's another review. Let's just get this out of the way. There's time travel, multiple dimensions, multiverses, mind control, possession. So while there's nothing wrong with the plot as laid out on paper, there's mystery and intrigue, but then there's Bayonetta's pulling tight narrative U-turns at 100 miles per hour with no explanation. It's very unlikely that everything in the story will make sense without playing Bayonetta 2, and even then, you probably still need to look up some of it online. If the actual direction of the story doesn't bother you, then the presentation might. When there isn't an action cinematic, a lot of the story is conveyed in still frames, but it does this frame-in-frame thing that just makes you wonder, what is this for? And who asked for this? So overall, pretty good story for an action hack-and-slash game. Okay, but I don't really accept the cop-out that action hack-and-slash games should have bad stories just because they traditionally do. And look, I know that action games can be cheesy and over the top, and that's not even what I'm talking about. The comedic and lewd moments in Bayonetta are great. The character development is decent too. Bayonetta has the bones of a good story, but a lot of the problems exist in the telling of it. Let's talk sound and music. The most important thing in any hack and slash game is the wind-up sound to an enemy's attack. The camera cannot be trusted, and as such, it gets to a point where you're more listening to the sound cue timings rather than watching the animations. Bayonetta succeeds at this most important task. Secondly, the hits are chunky and crunchy, and blood sounds are moist. It's everything you expect from a Platinum game. Bayonetta herself, voiced by Helena Taylor.
No, you get one thing straight. I'm not the slightest bit interested in the fact that you made these guns.
She's the right amount of British sexy sass while maintaining a superior aloofness. Helena Taylor has a level of presence that is hard to come by, and it would be a shame if something were to happen to her relationship with Sega that would somehow force Platinum Games to use a different voice actor. Soundtrack-wise, Bayonetta is mostly your usual orchestral affair that boils away in the background, but when Bayonetta hits her stride, we are treated to upbeat jazz that perfectly encapsulates Bayonetta. Getting into the zone, to quote,
As long as there's music, I'll keep on dancing.
Obviously, the most iconic song is the climax remix of Fly Me to the Moon, a song originally sung by Frank Sinatra. This is the song the game plays quite frequently, and why not? It's a banger and it hasn't aged a day. Fly Me to the Moon is so good that the practice of remixing classics would carry over into the following title. It's a nice tradition, and I'm sorry, but you're just not human if you're not into it. So yeah, look. Bayonetta is not perfect, but it's getting pretty darn close. It's wild to me that action hack and slash games haven't really changed all that much from the 2010s, and in some ways, older titles like Bayonetta have a maturity about them that some newer titles lack. Bayonetta knows what it is and what it isn't. Namely, Bayonetta is sexy, sassy, self-indulgent, and packed with action with the sole intent of making you think, what the hell will she do next? There's no way. Oh wait, she just did it. Like Rodin says he won't put chainswords on your arms, but if you perform a torture attack on a specific mob, you use a giant demon chainsaw and you get to keep this as a temporary weapon. Torture attacks don't usually work like that. Bayonetta is like a rich dessert in a world where every game is trying to be the main course. It's the mud cake that your coworkers all stand around until someone inevitably breaks the standoff and says, okay, just a bite, and then proceeds to cut half the cake before retreating to their office to enjoy it privately. Just do it. You know you like it. Gun to my head, and it's Scarborough Fair, I give Bayonetta a 7.5 out of 10.